Okay, for those of you joining us on the recorded session, welcome to Week 10 Montana Government Studies Seminar. We're going to go ahead and start our screen share here. I think we're on. Can everybody see that? We good?
Yes.
Yay, all right. Usually it has a little border around it and it doesn't, so I was concerned. All right, so just a few announcements this week as we're getting underway. Number one, you should now be working on the Unit 3 reading guide. Unit 2 test grades are in PowerSchool now. I did that yesterday. So overall, I thought that test was pretty good. Top grade was 100%, so there is no curve on those test scores. So those are raw scores. I mean, I automatically basically round up to the nearest whole percent. So if you got a 96, let's say, your actual score might have been a 95.3 or something like that. But I always round up to the nearest whole percent. But yeah, 100% was the top score, so no curve was applied other than rounding up to the nearest whole percent. Don't forget, your Week 10 discussion forum is due on Friday. Hopefully you did this before the break. At least you got on and did your main post. Please bear in mind that it becomes less of a discussion if you don't hop on until 7:45 on a Friday to do your initial post. The point of this is so that people can see what you post and respond to it. It's a discussion. I'm working on a way to better police that and basically try to deprive people of points if they don't post by a certain point, but I haven't fully figured out how to do that yet. So just please hop on early in the week, get it done so that people can actually read your thoughts and respond to them. Otherwise, it's not a discussion at that point. It's you just posting some crap. Don't forget to do the seminar assignments. Again, the CNN 10 quiz. If you did it last week when I posted the CNN 10 video, you're all good there. If you haven't done it yet, hop on. Please get it done as soon as possible. The journal, obviously, we didn't have a seminar session last week. I kind of decided that rather than try and have one the day break was going to start, I would wait, and we had the first one yesterday. I don't know, it was 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And I just decided, what the hey, we'll just do them both this week. So don't forget to do those. Remember, those are worth points, and lots of folks are basically just hurting themselves by not doing those seminar assignments. I'm not going to stop awarding points for them. I'm not going to ease up on that. So if you're factoring in, if you think, oh, he's going to eventually give up, I'm not. I'm way more stubborn than you are. So yeah, if you're not doing them, you're just hurting you. You're not hurting me. It doesn't hurt my feelings. I don't go, oh, they don't like me and they don't do my assignments. No, I just go, okay, you're not going to do it. Fine. I get to give you zeros. And also, please keep on your radar screen that the last current event submission is due on the 16th of this month. There is tons of Montana news out there right now. Our governor was just diagnosed with COVID. So there's an idea. The legislature is still in session. Yes, the every other year circus is still in Helena. So there's an option for you. They're doing all sorts of stuff. They're taking a stand against vaccination passports. So there you go. There's something for you. Find an article, summarize, give your opinion. Please give me a link to the article, or you can take a picture of it or whatever. Please put that in your document. Please don't try and upload 2 files. Just one document with, if you're including a photo, which if it's digital at all, just include the link. But if you got it out of the newspaper or something, put the photo right in your write-up, just either at the bottom or at the top. Just put it right in there. Makes life ever so much easier. And please tell me where if you're including a photo, please tell me what source you got it from. I'm assuming it's the Tribune, but every now and again people surprise me. So yeah, you got to tell me where you're pulling stuff so that I can kind of check it out. All right, there you go. Any questions about any of those announcements? I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so. All right, so we're talking railroads today because this is truly a transformative thing that happens to Montana. It's not one of the formative industries like what we talked about, but this is the key for those other formative industries to be able to sell their goods. It's key for ranchers to be able to send their cattle to market, for farmers to send their crops to market, for miners to send their mined stuff to market. So it's pretty vital to those industries that really kind of helped bring people to Montana, and the railroad's going to help bring people to Montana, but it's a conduit for those other things. That it's not like, oh, the railroad is going to bring a lot of jobs. I mean, it does, but not compared to mining and ranching and all of these other things. All right, so before railroads, transportation was quite slow. To travel to Montana overland, you could make generously about 15 miles a day. So it took 3 to 4 months to take your wagon and get to Montana from Missouri. About the end of civilization, if you want to call it that, which is a misnomer, but yeah. So 3 to 4 months to get to Montana overland. If you were going to take a steamship, that could cut the time in half. Steamships were a major advancement, but keep in mind, what do you need to be able to travel by a steamship aside from a steamship? Anybody have an idea?
Water.
Yeah, you need water. You need, well, money too, sure. But you need a body of water. You need a river to travel on, or maybe a canal, but typically a river. There are only so many places in this state that have rivers that are wide enough for a steamship to travel on, or that are connected to larger rivers. So the end of the line here in Montana was actually Fort Benton, which, if you get an opportunity this summer, if I'm not sure if they're going to be open, but you should take a drive up to Fort Benton. They have a great history museum up there. And it's a fun town to walk around. So much history in Fort Benton. If you get the opportunity, really, it's a really cool place. But Fort Benton was kind of the end of the line, because after Fort Benton is when you start getting the waterfalls that no steamship could go up those waterfalls. So that was as far as you could go in the state of Montana by water. If you were trying to get to, say, Missoula, you then had to travel overland to get to Missoula, and that would take you weeks of time. So the railroad was going to become essential to Montana to, for example, grow the mining industry, to bring in the equipment to make smelters for the copper, to bring in farm equipment and things like that, and also to ship all of that stuff to other markets. By the way, that is a stagecoach there. Wells Fargo, before it was a bank, was a stagecoach company, and in fact, in their advertising, I think to this day, well, before they were trying to say, "Oh, we're not evil," because they were like opening up fake accounts for for customers. But before that, all of their advertising showed a team of horses pulling one of these guys. But yeah, there's a song from I forget what Broadway musical. The Wells Fargo wagon is a coming down the street. Um, so yeah, Wells Fargo. So that was, I mean, if you were traveling, maybe you could afford to go by something like a stagecoach, but those were pricey, to ride in a stagecoach because it took a lot of horsepower, it took a lot of manpower to make those run, and it could only carry, 4 to 6 people. And if you were traveling in inclement weather, there was the full possibility that if the thing got stuck, you were going to have to get out and help push. I mean, imagine having to get off of your plane and push it to the runway or something like that. That's, yeah, we can't even think about that today. Okay, so the first railroad to touch Montana, and just barely touches Montana, is the Utah and Northern Railway. This is an off spur, a narrow gauge offshoot of the Union Pacific, which was part of the first transcontinental railroad. And after they completed that transcontinental railroad, Montana was now only a scant 500 miles from railroad access. So this became an offshoot of that using a narrow gauge track. I believe it was a
You're
350 track.
frozen.
Am I frozen?
Oh, you're good now. You just got
Oh,
unfrozen.
oh, good. All right. So this was a narrow gauge track, about a 3-foot track at the beginning, that was largely built by volunteer Mormon labor. This was intended to supply Mormon communities in Utah and Idaho, and it ran out of money to continue building and then was purchased by the what today would be billionaire, back then would be millionaire, industrialist Jay Gould. And Gould extended this into Butte because he saw that Butte was becoming and was a center of mining, richest hill on earth and all that. So they needed a way to get the ore from Butte to other parts of the country to be able to sell it. So it wasn't until so the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, that first route. But it wasn't until 1881 that the first train pulled into Butte. By the way, at this point, Butte was the second largest city in the western United States, second only to San Francisco, and certainly very, very important. Butte was practically a metropolis at this point, because of all of the miners showing up to stake their claims. Was known as the Pittsburgh of the West, which doesn't sound impressive by modern parlance, but Pittsburgh was a huge center of industry on the West Coast. So to be called the Pittsburgh of the West was kind of a big deal. Now Pittsburgh just has, a handful of Steelers. Ba-dum-bum. And some penguins. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, so this railroad only served especially in Montana, very small area, and not very many communities were served by this Utah Northern Railway. The spur that led into Montana was, again, really just an effort to get stuff out of Butte. It did not extend much beyond that. But it was the first railway to come into Montana. So there we go. All right. So, how did the coming of these railroads impact Native Americans? I would hope that immediately upon hearing that question, you would think the Native Americans got screwed, because that should be almost an automatic answer to how does this impact Native Americans. There's never going to be one of these stories that ends with, and the Native Americans prospered. No. Unfortunately, in the history of Montana, Native Americans again and again get screwed. Just plain and simple. So railroad companies. Suddenly, I became Elmer Fudd. Railroad companies. Railroad companies that were coming into Montana needed land, and these routes went through treaty lands, lands that had been negotiated, reservations. And so these railroad companies are going to join with political leaders and ranchers and others trying to abridge these Native American lands. The ranchers wanted land so that they could graze their cattle and, to a lesser extent, their sheep. The politicians just wanted more land that was not controlled by Native American tribes. And railroads didn't want to have to negotiate with tribes so much to lay their track through the West. So this was again a time period where, depending upon who was president, was how well these treaties were abided by the federal government. Some presidents were like, oh, well, this is a treaty and this has the force of law and we can't go against that. But most of them are going to say, it's a treaty, but it's with the Native Americans, so who cares? What are they going to do? Basically, because at this point, those Native American tribes were what will come to be known as domestic dependent nations. So without the United States, they would not, at this point, be able to really exist. Basically, they were living by the good graces of the federal government. Oh, good, my connection's unstable. Just what I want to hear. So in any case, tribes like the Crow in two separate renegotiations of their treaties will lose some 4.5 million acres to railroad and other interests. The Assiniboine, the Gros Ventre, and the Blackfeet will also lose good big chunks of land. But these tribes are sort of forced to submit. The Crow is an interesting story. Their leaders were brought to Washington to negotiate, and the tribe at this point was so desperately poor that they were basically coerced into submitting to the federal government's demands. Remember, a lot of these tribes had attempted to make a go of cattle ranching in the West that had brought money to so many, but as more and more white settlers came into the areas, they were taking things like the water resources. And so by the time the water got to the tribes, there wasn't much water left. So yeah, these tribes were basically sort of forced to submit. And again, in the history of Montana and the West, there's really never a time where, oh, this came out really well for the Native Americans. No, that's not how this story goes down. Okay, so one of the big railroads that comes into Montana is the Northern Pacific. And I was putting this together so fast that I didn't have a chance to proofread, so I apologize for my typos. So they will start building into Montana, and building railroads was an incredibly expensive business. And in order to finance that, the government wanted this done. The government is going to pay most of these railroad companies, although there's one exception that we're going to talk about here in a minute. They're going to pay them in land. So the government at this point did not have a huge budget, and they were not doing, what today would be termed like deficit spending to, oh, here's a bunch of money. What they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, for every mile of track you lay, we're going to give you 10 miles of land. And so railroad companies ended up with huge tracts of land in Montana and other states. The Northern Pacific, for example, ended up with an area about 39 million acres. That is the size of the state of Georgia. In the West, in Montana, 13.3 million acres, almost 15% of the state. Was owned by the Northern Pacific Railroad. That's absolutely massive. Railroad companies become the largest landholders in entire states, which is just insanity. The Northern Pacific Railroad was completed September 8th, 1883, and will allow basically through traffic through the state of Montana, transcontinental. So it linked up with other railroads to then you could travel from Montana to the ocean, which was a big deal all the way to the Pacific. The Great Northern is our outlier here. The Great Northern was not the beneficiary of land grants. The Great Northern was financed by private investors. Their major backer, their major sort of guy pushing this was James J. Hill. If you've heard of Hill County, that is who Hill County is named after. The Great Northern Railroad. Hill was a Canadian, by the way, and his entire goal in setting up the Great Northern Railway was to undercut the Northern Pacific, basically do it cheaper and get more people to send their freight on his lines than on the Northern Pacific. And eventually those two will merge into the Great Northern Pacific, which eventually, we only have one railroad company in Montana now, and it's Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which at one point was Burlington Northern, which was Great Northern, all sorts of mergers. So Hill attracted investors, including the Rockefeller family, to get involved in building this rail line, yet another transcontinental line through Montana. Incidentally, they all had to find different routes through the mountains, which became an interesting thing. So this one has some pretty significant history in Great Falls because one of their big building goals, they were building track faster than any other railroad ever had, some 116 miles of track per month, which was a huge amount of track. And their goal was to get to Great Falls. They reached Havre on September 6th and then went down to get to Great Falls. The Central Line, which was also owned by Hill, was coming to Great Falls, and those two lines were connecting, and eventually all of those got put together into the Great Northern Railway, which has, by the way, one of the absolute greatest signs in the history of railroad. I love that sign. I would like to find a tin sign to put up in my classroom next year for the Great Northern Railway. I'm sure I can find one. I just don't know that I want to pay big bucks for it. And then the third major one, and there's a whole bunch of minor ones, as we'll see on a map that I show you here in a minute. But the third major one to come into the state of Montana is the Milwaukee. This one also has a major part of Great Falls in it because that beautiful building down by the river is known as the Milwaukee Depot. So the rail line that came through downtown was Milwaukee. And this was actually several railroads, but they end up all being called the Milwaukee Line, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad. This was the third transcontinental line through the state of Montana, and it was the only one built in the 20th century. So this is the most recent railroad to be built in Montana, which shows you the state of America's infrastructure. So this was used largely by the Anaconda Company to ship copper between Butte and Anaconda and also up to Great Falls. They also used their clout to advertise homesteading opportunities. They ended up with a lot of land in the eastern part of the state, and they are going to advertise and sell that land. That's how a lot of these railroads ended up making back a lot of their money that they laid out for building these railroads was, oh, here we have all this land, come farm this land, buy this land from us. So the eastern part of Montana became this sort of farmer's paradise, which what the heck else are you going to do out there? This one was interesting too because rather than relying primarily on coal or wood to fire their engines, these were electrified trains. They would charge big dynamos on board their engines and use that in areas that there weren't electrical lines to power their trains. And this actually helped to form the Montana Power Company, which was Montana's electrical company from the early part of the 20th century into, when did we lose Montana Power? The late 90s, 95, 96, something like that, when the legislature deregulated and Montana went from having the cheapest electrical power in the country to some of the most expensive. So bravo, capitalism. So this map shows as of 1915, and again, thanks to America not investing in infrastructure after the 1940s, this is largely where railroad tracks still exist today. These are the major lines that were coming through and within Montana. Some of them were just here in the state. Some of them were coming through on their way to somewhere else. So the railroad really does change life in Montana. You might argue for the better. It connected towns and people. It carried goods and products both to Montana, things that Montanans before this couldn't get. Think, for example, building materials. Up to this point, before the railroad, you had to kind of use whatever was around you to build houses and businesses and things like that. Whereas with the coming of the trains, you could actually order prefabricated sort of house kits that could be put together on site. The most famous of these were craftsman houses sold by Sears. That's when you see there are a lot of these in Great Falls, and when you see, oh, this is a craftsman house, 9 times out of 10 these were kit houses that were put together on site, and they're some of the best made houses in American history. I mean, absolutely wonderful quality. If you can find a decently well cared for one, you can still, I mean, they're $200,000 or more to buy one of those craftsman houses. But houses and consumer goods of all kinds coming in, and then of course shipping what Montana was producing and sending it out. So everything from cattle and sheep to wheat and mining ore and all of these things going from Montana to be turned into finished products elsewhere. Because we didn't have a lot of manufacturing in the state, but we did have raw materials that were then sent out of the state. This carried entertainment, things like circuses, operas, theaters came through Montana, and oftentimes would stop and do performances along the route. It was not super high speed. It was certainly faster than traveling by horse, but they would stop and do performances all along the route, and we still get some of these things today, not because of railroads, but Great Falls. You get Broadway shows here in Great Falls that are typically on their way to someplace bigger. That's kind of how we end up getting those things scheduled. Is, oh, we're on our way to Spokane. Well, we'll stop for a night and do the show in Great Falls. Speaking of which, Alton Brown is coming here in the fall, which I'm very excited about. Already have my tickets. Improved communications. This was thanks to telegraphs, but telegraph lines went up right next to railroad tracks, so they basically were laid at the same time. They created whole towns, places like Livingston, Glasgow, Havre. Havre's a railroad town. I know Havre has it, but Havre wouldn't have nothing if it weren't for the railroad. Havre would not exist. It helped create Yellowstone and, that should say, Glacier National Parks. So Montana's 2 primary national parks would not exist without the railroad being able to bring people to them. So very important. And then finally, we get into modern times. Now, the most recent plans for a high-speed rail system, American railroads are antiquated AF, by the way. They are just absolutely behind the times. If you go almost anywhere else, railroads are much better than they are here in America. But the new infrastructure plan would like to fix that and install high speed rail. That high speed rail ain't coming to Montana. But the likelihood is that even though Montana will be bypassed by the high speed network, that they will have to put some money into modernizing and improving the existing rail lines in Montana. And there is a push for what's known as commuter rail here in Montana that would connect Montana's major cities. So think Billings, Bozeman, Butte, Missoula, maybe even Great Falls. Right now, if you want to catch a train as a passenger, you can only do that up along the High Line. You have to go to Havre or Shelby or someplace like that, West Glacier. But there is a push to expand passenger rail into the southern part of the state to connect, again, Billings, Bozeman, places like that. And you could see perhaps Great Falls becoming a part of that as well. So that'd be kind of cool if that were to happen. But again, we won't probably get high speed here for some time, but we're not a population center. So high speed certainly going where more people are. They're aiming to get the commute from New York to DC down to a very short amount of time. All right, there we go. So your journal topic for this week: how did the coming of railroads change? That should just be change Montana. Do you think Montana should use railroads more today? Would you ride a rail line between Montana cities if that were an option instead of, say, driving or riding the bus? Would you take a train? So there you go. There is your journal topic. Please write your response to that in the Week 10 Seminar Journal assignment on Moodle. Any questions about anything we covered today?